Hello everyone! In this week's video, I'm going to start the journey of trying to learn how to create video games. Since I was a child, I have always loved video games, and for many years I've wanted to learn how to make them. However, a big part of making video games is learning how to code, and this has always been very daunting. Over the years, I've gone in spurts of trying to learn how to code, but I always end up losing motivation. However, I've learned that if I make a YouTube video out of the thing I'm learning, I stay more motivated. So today we're starting a new series where I share my process of learning how to code. I'll be sharing the ups, downs, and confusion I experience along the way. So the first thing I needed to decide is what game engine do I want to use, / what coding language do I want to use. And since I am very much a beginner, I decided that I would start with Scratch. Scratch is a free-to-use visual programming tool that was built to teach kids and teens to work with code. It has different categories of coding blocks that you piece together to make your game. I decided to start with Scratch because I thought it'd be a good way to reintroduce myself to having a coding mindset, as well as the basics of coding. Now, I actually used Scratch as a teen. Apparently, I made my account 11 years ago. Wow, I feel old. And when I was a teen, I did make a short platformer game. As you can see, it's not the greatest. I mostly made it by copying coding I found from tutorials or other Scratch games. Even though it's not a masterpiece, I was very proud of it at the time. Also, I find it really funny how many of the comments on my profile are asking if this is the real Love to Draw manga. And some of the comments are really adamant that it's not. But yes, this account does belong to the real Love to Draw manga. Oh, and I did take the time to update my account, so it now looks like this. Anyways, now that I knew what game engine I would be using, I now need to figure out what kind of game I wanted to make. A lot of times for games, I want to make something like a story-based RPG. However, my concepts for this genre are always a bit too complicated and robust for a beginner. Plus, I was looking into how to make a dialogue system, and it's very complicated, so I'm staying away from dialogue-heavy games for now. I spent a good number of days trying to think of a game concept that was both interesting to me, but also fit my coding level. And while I was playing the new Fantasy Life game, I got an idea. In Fantasy Life, you have multiple lives, and you can be different levels in each life. Well, I noticed that my mining life had the highest level, and it was by a lot compared to my other gathering lives. And I do know I'm always a fan of mining in video games. I mean, I probably have hundreds of hours in Minecraft. So I thought I'd try to make a little cozy mining game. So now that I had a concept, I could start making some art. In Scratch, each sprite gets its own coding, so I need to make some sprites to work with. I'm starting by making a pickaxe. As you can see, I have my Millinote board open on the left with my references. For my game, instead of having a character that you control, it's going to be more of a point-and-click game. But I will give the player a companion that we will discuss later. For this game, I wanted to have a kind of warm and nostalgic color scheme. So I found this color palette on the Clip Studio Paint asset library, and I'm going to mostly try to use colors from this to keep my game's colors cohesive. Next, we of course need some rocks to break with our pickaxe, so I started drawing some rocks. I want the rocks to break as the player hits them, so I make multiple sprites that have the rock breaking. To keep the lower part of the rock consistent, I copy my main sprite and erase the top portion. Then I just draw in the new edges. That way the rock kind of gets shorter and shorter as it breaks. Also, I made multiple rock variants, but I just repeated the same process for each of them, so I'm not going to make you watch all of that footage. I exported each rock version, and now we have these. Lastly, I wanted something that the player can collect from the rock. And for now, it's going to just be a piece of coal. Coal is going to kind of be the currency of the game. Later on, I'll make gems that the player can collect, but that's not my focus for now. Now that I have some sprites to work with, we can go to Scratch and start doing some coding. Now, a lot of times for game dev videos that I watch, I notice that they'll often skip the coding part, since it can be kind of boring. But as a person trying to learn how to code, I always wish it was a part that was talked about more often. This video isn't going to be a step-by-step tutorial, but I'm going to try to share as much of the process as I can while still trying to keep things at least a little bit interesting. Also, for some of the coding process, I'm working on my iPad, so there sometimes isn't a mouse cursor to visually follow, but I will try my best to make things easy to follow. Anyways, to add a sprite, I go to this button and select Upload Sprite. I'm going to start with uploading my pickaxe. I want the pickaxe to follow the mouse cursor around to make it feel like the player is holding or using a pickaxe, instead of just the mouse cursor. I do wish that I could make the pickaxe be the mouse cursor, but that doesn't seem to be possible. So to start, I drag in the when green flag is clicked block. The green flag is basically the start button, so if I want something to happen when the game starts, I need this block. Then I go to motion blocks and drag in the go to block, set to mouse pointer. And when I click the green flag, it does go to where my Apple Pencil is located, but it doesn't follow it. That's because I need a forever block. This will make the block run over and over and over instead of only once. So it will make it so that the pickaxe always wants to go to where my mouse cursor is, or in this case, the tip of my Apple Pencil. And now it's working. Yay! The pickaxe is very large, so I drag in a set size 2 block and set it to a lower percentage. Also, when I did some off-screen testing, it doesn't work to have the pickaxe be directly under where the mouse pointer is, because then I can't click on other sprites since the pickaxe is in the way. So I drag in the blocks to change the X and Y positions a bit. Okay, so we have the pick, now let's make it hit some rocks. I loaded in my main rock sprite, and because it has some versions where it is broken, I need to give it some costumes. Costumes will allow us to change how the sprite looks in game. Now, to make it so that the sprite changes costumes depending on how much the player clicks it, we are going to need a variable. If you don't know, a variable is basically a name, and you can store something in it. So in this case, I'm going to make a variable called HP, and it will store the rock's hit point amount. I want this variable to be for this sprite only, since I want each rock variant that I'll add to have its own HP. If I had the HP set for all sprites, all the rocks would share the same HP bank, if that makes sense. And I don't want that. So when the green flag is clicked, the HP variable gets set to 10. And right here, when the sprite is clicked, the HP gets changed by -1. To make the sprites change, I used if statements. So if HP is less than 8, it switches costumes. I used an if statement for each costume change and made the number get lower and lower. Now as you can see, when I click the rock, its HP goes down and it switches costumes. Woo! But of course, now we need to make the player collect the coal I mentioned earlier. We don't want to be breaking rocks for nothing. For that, we need another variable that I will call coal. This one is for all sprites, since I want all sprites to be able to affect this one amount. I make it so that when HP is less than 1, the coal count goes up by 1. So the coal count will go up when the rock breaks. But I want there to be an animation when the player collects the coal. So let's add that in. I bring in my coal sprite, and in the coding for my rock sprite, I make a new broadcast called broken. A broadcast is basically a way for one sprite to tell another sprite when something happens. So when the rock breaks, it'll broadcast broken. And now I need to make the coal react to that broadcast. So I use the when I receive block and have it set to the broken broadcast. So this will make the coal receive the broadcast. So when the rock breaks and broadcasts broken, the coal knows to change size, go to the rock's location, and become visible. Also, I did have to change this from rock to mouse pointer later on in the coding, because when there were multiple rocks to break, it would go to the main rock instead of the clone I broke. So yeah, I instead set that to mouse pointer. Now this is cool and all, but I kinda need the coal to go away. So after playing around with the ghost effects block and Y position, I coded a little animation that fades in and out and raises the coal upwards. So we get this. Oh, also to make things more interactive, I made it so that when the rock is clicked, it makes a noise and also broadcasts hit. Then when the pickaxe receives hit, it changes angles to make it move back and forth like it's hitting the rock. I also had to change this later. At first I had it set to be changing by a certain amount of degrees, but if the player clicked very rapidly, the pickaxe would kind of start overturning and it wouldn't go back to its original spot. So I instead used blocks that set the pickaxe back to its specific degree instead of using plus and minus degrees. Okay, now that we have a way to break rocks and collect coal, I need to make it so that the rocks can randomly spawn in And this had its fair share of difficulties for a beginner like me. The most difficult part was that I didn't want the rocks to spawn on top of each other. This means I had to code a way for them to sense each other, but also relocate if one rock was touching another rock. This took a bunch of trial and error, but eventually I got this. The code starts by the rock possibly making a clone of itself. This allows for the number of rocks on screen to be random. Hey, so this is editing, Becca. I realized I never mentioned what clones were. In Scratch, you can make clones of the main sprite, and they basically behave the same as the main sprite. But you can also code clones in their own way by stating, like, when I start as a clone. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. That's what clones are. It then randomly picks an X and Y coordinate for its location, and then the game is forever checking if the rock is touching this color or one of the other rock sprites. If a rock is touching another rock, it will pick another random X and Y location until they are not touching. The reason I have this color one here is because I cannot set the clone rocks to not be touching the main rock, so I use the color instead. However, this doesn't always work, and sometimes the rocks do still end up touching. My husband did offer the idea of, instead of using clones, I make other sprites that use the same art. That way I can set each rock sprite to not touch the other rock sprites, and I don't have to worry about a rock touching itself. But I have not tried implementing that yet, so we'll see if that works. I hope this is all making sense. Hopefully editing me is doing a good job making this visually make sense. I basically had the same coding for the clone rocks. Also, I made it so that when the mouse hovers over the rocks, they get a bit brighter. That way it makes it more obvious to the player that the rock is clickable. At this point, I was feeling pretty happy that I got the rock spawning working. Little did I know that I would run into issues when I wanted to add going to other rooms within the cave. Speaking of which, let's work on that now. So I quickly whipped up some backgrounds. I wanted to keep them simple and stylized, but to be honest, I end up hating these and totally scrapping them. But for now, they will be placeholders. After exporting my 2 cave backgrounds, I went back to Scratch and loaded them into the backdrops area. Now we can go back to the coding area and click backdrops to code the backdrops and how they'll react to things. I start by making it so that when the green flag is clicked, it will switch to the first background. But now I need to make it so that when the player clicks on the hole in the wall, it changes to the next room. So I bring in this sprite that's just kind of a blob of the same color as the hole. I make it so that when the background switches to BG1, it goes to the location of the hole. Now, of course, we can't see the sprite now because it's the same color as the door, but that's the point. This big dot is just a way to make the doorway clickable for the player. I then make it so that when that sprite is clicked, the background switches to the second background. Later in the coding process, I set this to be the next backdrop instead, because I have more backdrops for it to switch between. I will also make it broadcast BG switch so that other sprites can know when the background is switching. Lastly, I make it change to be in the doorway for the second background when it switches to that background. Okay, so we have a way to move forward in the cave. Now we need a way to move backwards. I bring in this arrow sprite from the Scratch library as a placeholder for now, and make it so that when it's clicked, it'll take us to the previous backdrop. Now we can move back and forth between rooms, but as you can see, the rocks stay the same even though we're switching rooms, and so we need to make it so the rocks change. So I thought I could just copy my rock placement coding under a receiving block that receives the BG switch broadcast. I also added hide and show because my brain was thinking hide was the same as despawn, but it is not. So if I changed back and forth between rooms a lot of times, we would end up with this. We would just get more and more rocks spawning in, and they go really crazy because they're trying to not touch each other, but there's no space for them to not touch each other. And honestly, I didn't know how to fix this at first because I couldn't find a way to despawn or delete my main sprites. I eventually learned that I need to not have my main rock sprites be visible. I need to only have the clone versions be visible because they can be deleted. So I take the random placement code off my main rocks and instead just have it generate a clone while also being hidden. This way the player will only see the clones. Then when BG Switch gets broadcasted, the current clones are deleted and new ones are made. So now the rocks do switch, but when I switch backgrounds, sometimes you can see the rocks changing positions so that they are not touching. I don't want the player to see that, so I need to make a sort of loading screen. I draw a big black square that covers the screen. I then code it to fade in and out like I did with the coal earlier in the video. The only problem is that the scene was changing before my loading screen could fade in, so I had to go to each individual element and add a wait 1 second so that the loading screen had time to fade in. Now the viewer won't see the rocks shooting around the screen as they find their place. It was at this point that I learned that I don't like these crusty backgrounds. So I went back to Clip Studio Paint and made some new ones with the help of some assets from the Clip Studio Paint asset library. And instead of only 2 backgrounds, I made 4 backgrounds. I also made an arrow to replace the placeholder arrow. And once the backgrounds and arrow were done, I basically just implemented these by replacing the old sprites and background art with the new art. I also made a rock door for the final room, but we won't be talking about that until the next episode in the series. For now, before we end, I want to make the companion character I mentioned earlier in this video. I don't want the player to feel all alone in these caves, so I want them to have a little buddy that they can interact with. For the little buddy, I decided on a crow. I've talked previously in other videos about how I like crows. One of you pointed out that I probably like them because of Haikyuu, since the main team's kind of mascot is crows, and I think that assumption is correct. I kind of forgot that Karasuno had crows, and I think that is kind of what started me liking crows. It's kind of a myth, but it's often thought that crows collect shiny objects. Now, even though this is more of a myth, I thought this could still make the crow fitting to be our little buddy, since it will like the shiny gems that we collect. At first I was going to draw the crow holding a small lantern, but then I thought it'd work better to have the crow be standing on top of the lantern. I included the lantern because I thought it would help the crow feel like it has more of a purpose to the player. It holds the lantern. I have to say, I love drawing this little guy. I think he turned out really cute. I want to give him a name, so let me know if you have any suggestions down in the comments. My favorite part of this process was drawing the different expressions. He'll make a happy expression when you pet him, and a sparkly expression when you collect stuff. He will also have an idle blinking animation. Once the art was done, I basically added the main sprite and all of its costumes to scratch. I made code for each background that places him in a certain spot, so that he doesn't get in the way of things. This line of code is for the petting expression. I basically just make the sprite change costumes, and it needs to wait 0.2 seconds between each switch so that it plays like an animation. The same goes for the animation that plays when you collect things. Now, you may have noticed that I have this variable called emote. It changes emote by 1 at the start of the animation, and at the end it sets it back to 0. This is to make it so that the idle animation that is always playing doesn't interrupt the emote that is happening. The idle animation will only play if emote equals 0, so by changing emote by 1 at the start of the other animations, it'll make it so that the idle animation doesn't play. And so that's all I was able to accomplish for this video. So now let's take a closer look at how the game plays. I feel like I was able to make good progress in this video. There's still a lot of things I want to do and add, but I feel like this was a good starting point. In the next episode of the series, I plan to make a pickaxe upgrade that breaks this door, as well as a shop. I also want to make the crow a little cozy home that he lives in, but I don't know if we'll be making it to that in the next episode. I hope you all enjoyed this video and found it interesting. Hopefully it wasn't too boring. And if you did enjoy this video and are looking forward to the next episode in the series, please give this video a thumbs up to help support it. Before we end, I want to thank my super awesome YouTube members and Patreon patrons for their support. It means so much to me. And thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye!